Famous pianists and their technique, the English school, Matei, his pupils, and colleagues. Summary by Laura Aguirre. The chapter begins with a brief overview of the English schools of music. We have here the Royal Academy of Music, which was opened in 1823, and a lot of influence from Felix Mendelssohn was bestowed upon this school. Mendelssohn was performing quite a bit in Britain between 1829 and 1847. And in 1880, Tobias Mattei began teaching at the academy. We'll talk a little more about him later. And this academy also started doing extensive examinations on performance and theory with their students. A little later, the Royal College of Music was opened in 1882, which was the counterpart to the academy. And here's two faculty members that have links to some very famous piano teachers. We have Franklin Taylor, who studied with Clara Schumann, and Arabella Goodard, who studied with Kalkbrenner and Thalberg. And they, of course, probably inherited a lot of their music style from these great pianists from before. And as well, the Royal College also decided to join forces with the Academy and also give their students examinations based on their performance and theory level. On this slide, we have here some information on William Townsend, who was a gentleman who wrote a treatise called Balance of Arm in Piano Technique. And this was in the 1890s when this treatise was available, and of course still available today. Development of finger strength and independence through hand gymnastics was his big thing that he outlined in these essays that he wrote. And apparently, in comparison to Mattei and Brythop, Townsend was actually much more clear and much more detailed on what he wanted with this these piano exercises, this piano technique. He favored individual treatment of the finger and the piano key itself as a lever, and he focuses on muscular coordination of the hand and the arm. So going back to the lever, he was describing that you should not strike a key. Why would you strike it when you should be more pushing it down? Kind of comparing it to a pedal, the damper pedal, for example. You don't strike it, you don't slam your foot on it, you push it down. Same thing with an organ. On an organ, you push the key down, we don't strike the keys when we play the organ. He also discusses exercises for developing fine muscular coordination, and he describes here balance without hold, and that would be the arm that it glides up and down the keyboard with the wrist sometimes undulating, the fingers resting lightly but surely on the surface of the keys, none of which are depressed. And then also balance with hold would be with a single key depressed silently. The arm delivers the smallest degree of weight needed to keep it down. So balance for him is a very big deal for a finger independency. And that's the only way it can be achieved, is you have to have your arm in a state of balance. And lastly, he describes exercises controlling arm weight, and to put it simply, it's when you let your arm fall to the key, which I know a lot of us as piano teachers always talk about arm weight, and letting it kind of naturally drop to produce a good sound. Our main pianist of this chapter is Tobias Mattei, and he's an English pianist, teacher, and composer. He began teaching as a teenager and was initially taught untalented pianist, which encouraged him to question basic problems with piano technique. In 1880, he became the assistant professor at the Royal Academy of Music. And by the 1890s, all of a sudden, he had these wonderfully talented students that were winning competitions. And still in all, these experiences with all these students had him questioning things about piano technique, which compelled him to write a book called The Act of Touch, which was published in 1903. The Act of Touch is broken down into 4 parts. Part 1 includes an introduction, general aspects of the problems of pianoforte playing. Part 2, key treatment from its instrumental aspect. Part 3, key treatment from its muscular aspect. Part 4 is on position. The introduction is a preview on the intellectual, emotional perception, and artistic judgment of musical shapes. It is also a preview on the laws for controlling key treatment for good tone production. Mattei was very much against the old ways of repetitive practice that really had no point. He wanted to break down why you should practice a certain way and how you should practice this way to produce a really good tone on the instrument. On this slide, we're going to jump into part 2 of the Act of Touch. The previous slide, I briefly discussed the introductory, which was part 1, but this part here focuses on instrumental aspect of key treatment. Matei says here, treating the key as a lever, which is to be manipulated by the application and interaction of weight and muscular force or energy. There's also a list of about 16, what it says here, recapitulatory and summary of the main conclusions of part 2. And since there are so many, I thought to put the top 3 here, or the first 3, to give you an idea of what Matei was including in this part. First, we have here the pianoforte key is a machine to facilitate the production of speed in the string. It is a compound lever akin in principle to the seesaw. B, that tone production can only be affected by giving motion to the key, since this forms our only means of conveying motion to the string. C, energy brought to bear upon the key ceases to create tone, the moment that the place in key descent is reached where the hammer's motion culminates and causes sound to begin. And like I said, there's several bullet points here, and a lot of them actually do have similar principal points that Townsend also is trying to convey in his writings. Continuing here on part 2, Matei did some research on the writings of German physicist who wrote on the sensations of tone in 1862, and this gentleman's name was Hermann Helmholtz. And Helmholtz writes about theoretical intensity of the partial tones of the strings. This can be found on page 377. There's a chart there with a lot of numbers and information regarding this. It basically says that the louder one plays, the greater will be the intensity of the upper partials and overtones, and the more brilliant and harsh will be the quality of the sound. So Matei then began theorizing, and he had a non-scientific conclusion that tone quality could be varied in separate tones of identical intensity level produced by the same hammer. He has a list of arguments here against key hitting, and instead calls it prepared key attacks, and there's about 10 of them, and for the sake of time I'm listing 3 here and just kind of the bare bones of what each bullet point says. So A, mechanically thoroughly wrong and ineffective to do this, to be hitting the key instead of doing it in a prepared attack way. Also B, we cannot estimate the weight of the tool itself nor the amount of energy required to move it in any particular grade of speed. And he also includes here loss of energy. The concussion itself swallows up energy intended to produce tone. Part 3 of the active touch, Matei focuses on key treatment from its muscular aspect. Here he writes, we can only gauge key resistance by physically feeling it through the muscular sense before and during key depression. Since the key must be reached so carefully, the contact should never be in the form of an actual blow unless accuracy as to notes and expression do not matter. So he's very detailed here on the physical, your actual muscle approach to playing a note or playing a key on the piano. He has other details also, and there's about 24 bullet points here. And once again, there's so much information to mention, so I'm just gonna sketch this out right here. The other things that he focuses on are resting touch, which I understood it as what your finger is feeling before and after the actual note is played, and he calls this on the surface level of the keyboard and the bottom level of the keyboard. And also adding energy to the key, this is added impetus touch. Once again, how fast your velocity per se, I guess, hits the key to produce the tone and perhaps dynamic range as well. And he also talks about the construction and formation of touch, which I will elaborate on the next slide. Here we have an elaboration on the construction and formation of touch. This is the added impetus section I was talking about on the previous slide. So the first species is finger exertion alone with passive hand and self-supported arm, and this can be described as a loose lying hand on the keyboard. Second species, hand exertion behind the finger with self-supported arm, and this is moderate velocity used to produce a moderate tone intensity. And then the third species is momentary lapse in arm support behind the hand and the finger exertions. So weight is very important here, and this is to obtain the fullest tone. To conclude part 3, Matei talks about finger attitudes, and here's a picture of what he's describing here, the bent finger or thrusting attitudes associated with flat finger or clinging attitude used with weighted touch. He also goes into detail about forearm rotation and how this provides more precision for thumb use. And then part 4 is actually the shortest of all the parts. and it focuses on position. And he states here that you can have the correct muscular actions and inactions, but it's necessary to have the correct position of limb and body. So some of the things that are touched upon is bench location, avoidance of depressed knuckle, readjustments of wrist height depending on thumb alternating on black or white keys. Here I'd like to point out two pianists that actually had opposing views on Matei's technique style, and that was Thomas Fielden, and he studied at the Royal College of Music. He did not agree with Matei or Breitop's techniques. According to him, he thinks that they did not emphasize, or that Matei did not emphasize enough on physiology, muscular actions, or law of mechanics in terms of the laws of leverage on playing the piano. He himself did write a book called The Science of Pianoforte Technique, and there's another pianist, James Cheen, who also studied at the Royal Academy of Music, and he disagreed with Matei on arm and finger weight distribution. He, in turn, strongly emphasized the psychological aspects of piano playing, and he also wrote a couple of books, one being The Piano Technique Foundation Principles and The Amateur Pianist's Companion. In conclusion, Matei had a profound impact on piano technique. His writings always stressing the importance of individual use of fingers, but he was against the overuse of arm weight, as he didn't like that finger hitting technique that came from the past. And he emphasized sensitivity of touch and just the physical sensations overall of playing the instrument. And I think at this point he was one of the first pianists that really wanted to delve into this and dissect this subject and try to explain how does one achieve these movements on the piano, though some would say he didn't do the best job of it, but considering he was one of the first that really tried to do this, it's quite interesting to me. His research and writings are an important contribution to pianism, but he should also be credited for being a successful teacher. And unfortunately, there wasn't enough time to include some of the student accounts here that were included in this chapter, but I will say from Myra Hess, and there's some other students listed here as well. Myra Hess said that he was quite an encouraging teacher and that she was about to perform, and apparently, what I gather here, she was nervous, and he basically told her, enjoy yourself, enjoy the music, and at the end of the day, that's kind of the kind of teacher we need to be, is an encouraging one, you know, to keep this wonderful art and this craft alive. Why make someone afraid of it? We want to make them love it and want to keep playing.